Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm hanging out again with my friend Kat from the creativeintrovert.com. Kat aggregates all of your questions, and then we make these really fun little Q&A episodes to discuss and unpack them. So thanks, Kat, for being here again today.
Oh, you're welcome. So today we're going to be talking about your approach to astrology. You get a lot of questions coming through about this. So I guess let's start with, tell us what kind of astrology you practice.
Right. So I would say that my approach is a hybrid because I started with about 5 years worth of practicing and learning different modern forms of astrology: evolutionary astrology, modern psychological, archetypal, astrology and psychology. So, I cut my teeth on a lot of stuff that's really unique to the modern era of astrology. And then about 5 years in, I sort of turned my focus toward investigating the philosophical, historical roots of astrology, as well as the methods and practices of traditional astrologers from, say, Renaissance, medieval, back to the Hellenistic period. And what I found is that also, the further back you go, the more in common astrology also has with Indian astrology, Western Greco-Roman astrology, Greek or Hellenistic astrology, has a lot in common with ancient Vedic astrology. So yeah, so and as I did that, it's for me, what I struggled in modern astrology, though a lot of things resonated. I struggled with feeling like that there was a certain amount of incoherence and structurally, and a lot of idiosyncrasies that were based on practitioner personalities. And I really wanted to understand, like, if this is like a karmic science, we have houses, signs, planets, aspects. It feels like a very coherent philosophical structure, a tool, not unlike the I Ching, which is something I also was studying when I first started studying astrology. And if I know anything about the I Ching, and this is sort of informing my view of astrology at a certain point, it was that it was designed by a group of mystics in a very specific way for very sort of specific purposes and uses. And over time, it sort of evolves and changes. But what I really wanted to do was get down to the roots and figure out what was going on and try to find a more coherent philosophy and methodology, a kind of consistency of craft language, which I was feeling very frustrated by with when it came to sort of modern astrology. So that led me to practicing, eventually to adopting sort of different medieval approaches, especially horary astrology, as well as ancient Hellenistic astrology for reading natal charts. Some people call it Greek astrology, and like I said, it shares a lot in common with Indian astrology.
Hmm. Yeah, and you say it's got a lot in common with that, but you use the tropical zodiac, am I right?
Yeah. So ancient Western astrologers use the tropical zodiac and whole sign houses, some use for quadrant houses too, but mostly whole sign houses. Indian astrology uses whole sign houses. Um, you're using the traditional seven planets, not the outer planets. Although I like, again, a little bit of a hybrid. I have uses for the outer planets, though they're not given sign rulerships. And you use ancient timing techniques. Modern astrology mostly relies on, for example, transits. I use transits, but also Time Lord systems like zodiacal releasing, annual perfections, lots of other things. So, yeah, there's the techniques are a little bit different. But for me, the zodiac difference between ancient Western and the tropical sidereal split that happened wasn't clear cut. Like there's examples of practitioners in both the East and the West using each other's zodiacs. And Vic DeCara, who's a really good astrologer, does a video on a number of videos he's done. He's sort of, in some ways, made his career on demonstrating how a number of ancient Vedic texts point to a tropical zodiac that was in use in India as well. So it's not a clear cut thing, but I've said this to you before, which is just that in our classes and things like that, which is that the two zodiacs to me are not. It's not about which one is more correct than the other. Maybe it could be, and I don't know, or I don't have the mind to understand how it is. But I think of them like in the way that you entrain yourself to a shaman, for example. the shaman has a rattle or a drum, and they have beats that they use and songs that they sing to invoke the spirits. And it's really that you're learning the way that they did it, and the way that the tools that they use, you're entraining yourself to, so that the spirit can come through and sort of speak through them. I believe that the differences between the zodiacs are just sort of conceptual, philosophical differences, lead to slightly different ways of doing astrology, but I've seen such good, accurate results. Oftentimes the same timelines, predictions around the same themes and events at certain times in your life, et cetera, from both systems, that I think to myself, well, there's got to be some reason that they're both capable of working. And I've just never bought into the idea that it's like, well, yeah, one system's mistaken and the other not, because you have thousands of years of evidence to the contrary. And I think that's part of astrology itself, which is that, even though the ancient astrologers weren't using the modern outer planets, they work. They can be used to great effect. But so can the traditional methods. They can also be used to great effect. And one of the reasons, I guess, that I sort of started focusing on ancient practice is because there were such clear and consistent rules and techniques that I could rely on to help me make decisions that I often felt overwhelmed to make as an astrologer.
Yeah, when it comes to the zodiacs, I think the best analogy that I've heard, and maybe it's overly simplistic, but like if they were like languages, like French isn't more correct than Spanish or Italian. But I guess you can speak incorrect French. So there are things that you can do wrong in astrology.
Yeah, I mean it's the fine line I'm trying to walk whenever I talk about this with people, because I'm not someone who believes that any and every form of astrology is correct. I believe that by the grace of divinity, that people can use tools like, for example, there's a lot of readings that I did when I was practicing modern astrology for like the first 5 years of my practice, that where I was able to say or see things in the chart that were very accurate or precise, or make really good predictions, forecasts, and so forth. I've been able to make, I think I was able to make them because the ultimate thing that the tools or the methods are in service to a larger spirit that's coming through, that the reader is connected with. I do believe that. And so I don't believe our tools and our rules and our methods have to be perfect, because even Hellenistic astrologers today aren't really Hellenistic astrologers. In some ways, people have said that we're like neo-Hellenistic astrologers, because you're trying to restructure or piece back together the way that ancient astrologers practice, and you just don't know exactly how they practiced. So part of it is you're making it up as you go. So it's kind of this neo thing. In that sense, I have to admit that lots of different kinds of astrologies can work. In other words, they can describe, speak, predict accurately the events or patterns of a person's life. But I do believe that, for example, when I was able to understand what a house is, what a sign is, what a planet is, and how they're different from one another, and when I was able to kind of go very deeply into the conceptual roots of where these things came from, and understand the 12th house or understand the 6th house in the way that it was originally conceived, that made my practice better, because it also it stripped away a lot of confusion. For example, in modern astrology, you're often taught that the 12th house has something to do with Pisces and Neptune. Now, whether those associations are valid or not and could lead to doing, some good astrology, I'm open to that. But what I'm not open to is the idea that that the 12th house, originally came from the association with the sign of Pisces. It didn't. Right? It has a different set of conceptual. There's a different conceptual rationale behind what the 12th house originally meant, or what any of the houses meant, than what you'll generally learn in modern astrology. So to me, there was like stripping away a lot of misunderstandings that helped me to cultivate an astrology that I think is more accurate and more historically sort of in tune. and so I'm very passionate about that because I think a lot of people could, their practice of astrology could get a lot better and clearer if they learned about those things historically. But I'm still a person in the modern era. I'm not living in the ancient world. I also there's a lot of value that I've learned from modern psychological, archetypal, and even evolutionary astrology, elements of which have come into my practice in ways that I'm not always even conscious of. So I have to admit that, I don't think that there's just one right astrology. There are astrologies, plural, but I do think that there are misunderstandings that exist, and I'm not someone who buys into this idea that anything and everything goes and that it's all equally true. It's your truth, my truth, anyone's truth, whatever. So I think somewhere between being like an absolutist and being like a total relativist is where I find myself.
Yeah, it sounds like it's worth trying to discover your truth when you're learning astrology. And even Hellenistic astrologers disagreed about things, didn't they? So
They did, yeah. They definitely did. It's never been like, I mean, because it's like music, there's musical scales that exist in this sort of ideal sense, but everyone plays them a little bit differently. Everyone understands how one note hangs off another a little bit differently, and there's an art in the way that we relate to that musical scale. I guess what changed my practice the most was in realizing that in modern astrology, people were in a sense not understanding the nature of that musical scale. It's like we know how to play the notes, but we haven't taken enough time to understand the metaphysical structure of that scale. And that metaphysical structure of the scale, for example, the 12 houses, the 12 signs, the 7 planets, the aspectual configurations, that there's some really like foundational metaphysical structure in astrology, and I wanted to understand what that was, and I feel like everyone could deeply benefit who's into astrology to learn more about that historically, regardless of where you end up in terms of how you practice or what methods or approaches you use, because it's sort of like musical theory could only enhance someone's, you kind of think if everyone can play an instrument, that's great, but if they also understand the theory behind it, that's going to do nothing but really just enhance their appreciation of what they're doing.
Yeah, it's hard not to get evangelical about that when you learn it. I mean, that's what I've experienced, as I've told you, just trying to explain to somebody why you can go beyond the 12-letter alphabet and what you find when you do that. It's just when you get so excited about it, it's hard not to want to explain that to people. And yeah, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Like it's just so everyone understands, the 12-letter alphabet would be like Aries equals first house equals Mars, Taurus equals second house equals Venus. And the problem with that most people are taught on is that they're not getting a proper understanding of the difference between a sign, house, and a planet. And also they're not getting an understanding of what they have in common, what they have in common, and what differences there are. And then we're also not understanding, how the houses were originally conceived of, which was actually quite elaborate and astronomical. It's not just a simple, we'll have a 12th house, we have a 12th sign. What does the 12th sign mean? Then the house will kind of have similar meanings. It wasn't like that. I think that it's a tough thing, because it's like, do people do effective astrology, meaning helpful to the soul, with a misunderstanding about some of the core conceptual philosophical underpinnings? Yes, they do. I believe that is because that there's gradations. It's like you have a certain amount of understanding of the system you're using, it'll deliver a certain amount of truth. My experience is that the more that you get into and understand the philosophical underpinnings of the methods, techniques that ancient astrologers practiced, the better your practice gets. But that doesn't mean that I can say that someone practicing in the modern era is doing nothing right or has no ability to do any good astrology. So it's tricky.
What do you think about the idea that astrology, like us, is evolving? So, the fact that you do, and you said you have brought in the more recently discovered planets. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's tricky, right? Because it's not, to me, it's not an either or. It's not either it's evolving or the past was where it was at. Because those are the binary that's the binary that we're given the choice between, right? Either go back to the roots, worship at the altar of the past, or believe in evolution and worship at the altar of the future. One of the things that I really like that ancient mystics happened to believe was in a cycling of ages. For example, you have light ages and you have dark ages. And that also, what did Taoists and Confucian philosophers tell us about the nature of time and experience through time and history? They said that contraction and expansion are things that are they're embedded within one another, right? So there's a way in which progress is always experienced as also as the seeds of de-evolution, and regression or collapse or contraction or de-evolution is also contains within it the seeds of evolution, and that evolution and progress and or something or de-evolution and regression of some kind, that these are archetypal realities that recur in cycles and patterns. So, for example, in the modern era, we for example, we've made a lot of strides when it comes to basic human rights around the world compared to what they were, in like the medieval era. I mean, practically speaking, you could say that there are still a lot of problems in the world today. I'm not denying that at all, but basic human rights have increased in some ways. The care or concern for human rights, for human dignity. So things have gotten better. Or you could say, maybe I'm not making a great case there. Maybe you could say that there's also been advancements in medicine. We have antibiotics now. Lifespan can be a little bit longer, and you could suggest that that's a mark of progress. At the same time, because of the industrial scientific revolutions so full of themselves when it comes to this idea of progress and evolution, we're really doing a lot of harm to the earth, to the ecosystem. Where climate change is happening as a result of our own basically selfish interests that we call evolved, or we call them advancement. And so I think that there's ways in which when we take steps forward, they're not just like unanimously. There's also steps of going backward that are happening at the same time. So, for example, I think that in modern astrology, one of the ways in which I think we've moved forward is in a sort of participatory psychological astrology, looking at our own behavior, reflecting upon our own behavior and attitudes and participation in relationships. And modern astrology is focused much more on that. And I think that that's a mark of progress, because although the ancient astrology had a lot of values, it tended to be I would say, a little bit more deterministic. So one of the ways that you can change your karma is to become more aware of yourself and your activities and your involvement in your own fate, right? And that's there's been a lot of emphasis on that in the modern era of astrology. So good, thumbs up. However, there's also been a complete aversion in modern astrology that I would call regressive and not at all evolved, that denies that there are any forces or powers greater than our own egos, right? And that tends to be like a hubris of modern New Age thinking. I'm the manifester of everything. I can do whatever I want. I have no limitations. I can throw off. There's possibilities, not karmic fate. You know what I mean? And I think that represents an arrogance of the modern era. So you have a little bit of both. There's a little bit of evolution. There's a little bit of regression. And I think that that's always been the case. So I look at it more in terms of there's change that happens. Were ancient astrologers in possession of absolute truth? No, because they're humans and they're receiving a divine, an understanding of something that's very high level, just like the people who were in reception of the I Ching were. I mean, this is like really high level metaphysical stuff that they're downloading, so to speak. But our understanding of truth and of reality changes over time. And as it changes, we receive new tools and new insights, and they can be added or sort of grafted on. I think astrology is really flexible in that regard. But on the other hand, as things go on, we can also get really out of touch with things. For example, in the modern world, people will be very quick to say that we're evolved in this way or that way. Let's just say you could say I'm much more evolved than an ancient person. Well, it's easy to say that because it's very easy to look at the glaring flaws of ancient civilization. But for example, when it comes to living more in touch with the animated spirits of nature, I highly doubt that we're more in touch with that today than people were 3,000 years ago. So I think that you always have to, and for that reason, that's why I would call my approach sort of hybrid. Well, there's ways in which I'm undoubtedly sort of modern in my approach to astrology. By understanding my roots and by spending time with, indigenous shamanic traditions in South America, studying the ancient roots of yoga philosophy and ancient Western esoteric philosophy, and by also understanding people like Carl Jung, James Hillman, the depth psychology movement, and really having spent a lot of time with studying things like evolutionary astrology and modern psychological astrology, I feel that I've been able to pick up some good things from modern astrology and graft them onto a very deep and comprehensive understanding that I've been developing of ancient astrology.
That's great. Thank you. And what would you define as a good, helpful reading?
Well, the what kind of gets down to what is the purpose of astrology, and this is why I was so compelled by ancient astrologers and made this my practice, is because the goal is so clearly defined. On the one hand, there's a practical goal, and that goal is to accurately describe the events or qualities of a person, of their life, and also to predict them. And we do this in order to literally serve as like karmic weathermen. Just like, this is going to happen around this kind of time. And if you're prepared for that, then you know what kinds of themes, what gods you're sort of working with, so to speak. I think it really helps. On the other hand, I think that there's an internal, deeper spiritual purpose that an astrology reading serves. And that purpose is to help a person to, basically, we're helping a person to reinforce the remembrance of their own soul. And astrology does this in a funny way, right? Because you're going in to talk about the karmic weather, and that's the practical level of it, or the karmic experiences that you've had. But in doing so, what you're also doing is to help a person remember, you're a soul journeying through this lifetime in this body, in this karmic dimension with this karmic weather. And to help a person remember that the purpose of your life is to inquire, who am I? Why am I here? What's real? Where do I find the love? Where do I find happiness? And I think astrology can serve as a sort of a form of spiritual counseling to help a person remember that the purpose of all experiences, all karmic weather whatsoever, is to gently keep bringing us back to the wellspring of happiness that exists in our own heart and soul. So I think that an astrology reading should be gently reminding people of that somehow. And it can do so in many different ways. Every conversation is different. It might have a different inroad to helping a person remember, what is the purpose of my experiences? What is the purpose of my life?
Beautiful. Thank you. That's all I've got for today.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Those are tough questions. I'll just reflect on this at last, because we actually did a redo of this video because I was having a hard time articulating myself the first time we did it. And one thing that I will tell people that I think it's a good struggle to have is that, there's a part of us, because there are different forms of astrology that exist over a long period of time. And there is this sense that it's hard to find some kind of pure, untainted, absolute truth in terms of a form of astrology that one would practice. That sometimes leaves us in this place of saying, well, astrology is just a mishmash. It's just a mishmash, and kind of anything is true, and your truth is as good as my truth is as good as the next truth. And I don't think that's the best way of dealing with the problem that we have as astrologers when we're trying to figure out, okay, what's real here? What really feels like sturdy, reliable, truth to me as a practitioner, of why I'm doing it, of which tools I use, of which form or practice I take up. And instead of just being like throwing our hands up and being like, well, there's lots of different truths and it's kind of, I'm just sticking to mine and you've got yours. And I think rather than going down that path, we should double down on saying, no, it's really important to me to discover more and more of what I believe that the truth is. And we can go down this path and learn, and especially studying ancient astrology. This is where I am evangelical about it. I'm like, if you just study the history and the philosophy and the changes in approach and method over the years, and keep on that path and keep inquiring, slowly your commitments are going to define themselves. And they don't have to define themselves in ways that makes everyone else wrong and you right, but they also will define themselves so that you don't feel left in that place of being like, well, I don't know if this is true or not. It's just my truth. We need something that's more committed than that. And we can get there by being a little bit more persistent in our questioning of where things come from, how they came to be, what is a sign, what is a house. I just recommend that everyone keep pressing those questions because, in my opinion, the ability to be a good reader is tantamount to the ability to continually be a good student who's asking more and more. Don't settle for a paradigm that just, gives you all the answers and doesn't leave some place for you to keep going deeper into the spiritual or philosophical rationale behind why you're doing what you're doing. That's it.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. So thanks everybody for watching. I hope that this was an enjoyable Q&A episode. These are good questions. Some of them really hard to answer. But thank you all of you for coming up with them. So if you have more questions, feel free to email us info@nightlightastrology.com. Leave your comments and reflections in the chat box below. Be sure to check out Kat at thecreativeintrovert.com. All right, that's what I've got. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.